The war between the Verith Dominion and the Kale Ascendancy had lasted 60 years. It had swallowed 4 smaller civilizations whole. It had turned 3 star systems into cold debris fields where nothing would grow for another 100 years. After 60 years, both sides were tired, not tired enough to feel shame about what they had done, but tired enough to finally sit at the same table. The problem with peace was that it needed a witness. Someone neutral. A species with no territory worth taking, no fleet worth shooting at, no record of burning other people's worlds for gain. The galaxy's great powers looked around the table and made their list of candidates. Humanity was near the bottom of it. They were chosen anyway. Earth's diplomatic council received the notification on a Tuesday morning. No ceremony came with it. No formal delegation. It arrived as a standard data packet with an attached document full of subclauses and formal language that Claire Voss had to read 4 complete times before she let herself believe what it was actually asking. The Verith tradition was old and very specific. Peace guarantors did not simply sign papers. They gave something living. The guarantor species, Earth, now, whether Earth had wanted that or not, would send a man. That man would enter a formal spousal bond with the High Empress of the Verith Dominion. He would live at her court. He would be, in the precise language of the clause, a living symbol of the treaty's sincerity. Claire sat in her office a long time after she finished reading. She was very good at keeping her face calm. She kept it calm now. Then she opened a blank document and started making a list. She crossed off most of the names on it. Politicians were wrong, too loud, too obviously hungry for something the Verith court would smell before the man even opened his mouth. Soldiers were wrong, the Verith had spent 60 years at war and they could read aggression in the way a person stood, before any words were exchanged. Scientists were possible, but scientists had a habit of becoming curious about the wrong things at the wrong moments, and in a foreign imperial court, every moment was the wrong one for the wrong kind of curiosity. She kept returning to one name at the bottom of her notes. Ethan Cole. 38 years old. Geophysical engineer from Portland, Oregon. He had spent 14 months alone on a deep-sea pressure monitoring platform in the Pacific Ocean, watching fault lines that shifted so slowly that most instruments couldn't register the movement at all. The conditions on that platform were the kind that pushed trained researchers to request early transfer after 3 weeks. Ethan had stayed the full 14 months. He came back thinner. He came back quieter. He came back completely and stubbornly unbroken. Claire met him at a coffee shop 2 blocks from his apartment. He was already there when she arrived, reading a geology paper on a battered tablet, drinking coffee with nothing added to it. He looked up when she sat down and waited for her to speak. She told him everything. All of it. She laid it out plainly, the treaty, the tradition, the clause, what it would look like to the rest of the galaxy and what it actually was underneath that look. She did not soften it or frame it gently. She gave it to him straight because she suspected, correctly, that he was the kind of person who did not benefit from softening. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, not the quiet of someone deciding, but the quiet of someone who had already arrived at their answer and was simply giving it a little space before speaking it aloud. He said he would need 2 weeks to close his accounts and properly hand off his current project to someone who could continue it. He asked whether the food at a Verith imperial court was safe for human digestion. She told him, honestly, that she didn't know. He said that was fine. He would figure it out when he got there. That was the whole conversation. The announcement went out 3 days later. The galaxy's news networks covered it with the relaxed tone they used for mildly interesting footnotes. A human husband. A decorative gesture from a species barely old enough, by galactic standards, to be taken seriously. The Verith Dominion had 14,000 years of recorded history, and now it was anchoring its peace treaty to a planet that had only recently learned to cross the space between stars. The Kale Ascendancy's diplomatic corps sent a formal note of acknowledgement. The phrasing of that note was, in its punctuation and its careful word choices, very close to a polite laugh. No one was alarmed by Ethan Cole. He was the symbol. The warm body in a political clause. The prop that made the treaty feel real. On the morning of departure, Claire walked with him through the long corridor to the shuttle bay. 11 years she had been doing this job. 11 years of watching alien representatives smile at humanity the way adults smile at a child who says something accidentally clever, with warmth, with condescension, with the unspoken certainty that the child will never quite understand what the adults understand. 11 years of keeping her face still through that. She was keeping it still now. She told him to be careful. Not because she thought he was reckless. Ethan Cole was not a reckless person. She said it because there was nothing else she could say that fit inside a shuttle bay. He nodded once. He picked up his bag, which was a single bag and not a large one, and walked to the boarding ramp without looking back. He did not look nervous. He did not look like a man performing composure for someone watching him. He looked like a person who had already moved past the part where most people stand still and hesitate, and was simply inside the work now. The shuttle lifted from Earth. The sky went from blue to black. The stars opened up around him in every direction. The transit to Sail Prime took 3 weeks at jump speed. Ethan spent the first week going through everything in Earth's diplomatic archives that related to the Verith Dominion, court structure, cultural customs, political history, the names and ranks of the key figures he would likely encounter. He read carefully. He made notes in a paper notebook he had brought from home, the same kind he had used on the Pacific platform. He slept 6 hours a night. He ate whatever the ship's kitchen produced without complaint. The second week, he started on the Verith language. The third week, he practiced it alone in his cabin, quietly enough that the ship's crew did not hear him through the walls. He made the same wrong sounds repeatedly. He corrected them. Made them again. Corrected them again. He was not in a hurry about any of it. By the time the ship dropped out of jump speed and Sail Prime filled the forward window, a world of deep rust-red stone and wide pale sky, he could say 47 words in Verith. They were not impressive words. They were words like where and temperature and pressure and does this need to be repaired. The welcome ceremony on the surface was long and formal and conducted entirely in the galactic common tongue, which everyone present assumed was the only language the human could manage. Empress Sail Verith stood at the center of it all, tall, still, dressed in the Dominion's ceremonial deep red and silver. She had the particular stillness of someone who had been powerful for a very long time and had stopped needing to demonstrate it. She glanced at Ethan once, briefly, the way you check a delivered item has arrived in one piece, and then she looked forward again. He looked back at her for that moment. He did not smile too wide or stand too straight. He was simply there, steady and quiet, like a piece of equipment that had been properly set and was ready to run. The ceremony ended. He was shown to his quarters. He was given a schedule of functions and appearances. He was left, by everyone around him, largely to himself. That first evening, 2 junior court officials walked past him in the corridor outside his room without lowering their voices. They were talking through a disagreement about border patrol schedules. They named specific stations. They used specific numbers. Ethan went inside. He opened his notebook. He wrote down exactly what he had heard, in exactly the order he had heard it, with no detail left out. Then he sat at the small desk by the window and finished the geology paper he had started back in the coffee shop in Portland. The Verith Imperial Complex was not a palace in any way that Ethan's language had a clean word for. It was more like a city that had decided to become a single building. Hallways stretched for half a kilometer without a single turn. Chambers had ceilings high enough to have their own air patterns. Gardens grew inside, under glass panels that filtered the pale Sail Prime light into colors that had no names in English. It was very large and very old and very sure of itself, the way only things that have survived everything tend to be. Ethan learned his way around it in about 10 days. He walked every corridor he was permitted to walk. He nodded at guards who never nodded back. He found the kitchen delivery entrance on the east side and figured out which hours it was quiet. He located all 3 of the building's main water pressure systems by the sound they made inside the walls. The vibration was different for each one if you pressed your ear close and knew what to listen for, which he did. He attended every function on his schedule. Every single one, including the administrative sessions that were clearly for internal court business and had nothing to do with him. He sat at the end of the tables where he was placed and he listened and kept his face interested without being eager, which was a careful balance he had learned during long months alone on a platform in the middle of the ocean, where the work required full attention and no one was ever watching to be impressed. The court did not know what to do with him, so it did what ancient institutions do with things they don't understand: it put him somewhere and moved on. There was no malice in it. The Verith court had been operating for 14,000 years. It had seen empires come and dissolve. A human husband was, at most, a temporary curiosity that would eventually become part of the background. He was placed at tables. He was fed. He was dressed in acceptable formal clothing by court attendants who handled him with the efficient impersonal care of people performing a task, not engaging with a person. He was not spoken to about anything that mattered. By the end of the 4th month, Ethan could follow most spoken Verith conversations without the translation device on his collar. Not perfectly. His understanding of the language was still incomplete, and his pronunciation, when he tried to speak it, was wrong in ways that native speakers would have found amusing if they had known he was trying. But he could follow the meaning of what people said around him. He could tell the difference between formal speech and unguarded speech. He could catch the specific words that people used when they were not being careful about who was listening. He kept using the translation device. He kept letting the court believe he understood nothing they said in their own language. He kept his face exactly the same at every session, every dinner, every formal appearance: attentive, pleasant, slightly out of place. He kept listening. His marriage to Empress Sail Verith was a series of choreographed appearances. They stood together at 7 different ceremonies over those first months. They attended 4 diplomatic dinners where representatives from other species came to confirm, in person, that yes, the human husband existed, yes, he was physically present, and yes, the treaty was therefore real and not a piece of paper with a name on it. Verith was never unkind to Ethan in these moments. She was precise and correct and entirely elsewhere in her attention, the way someone can be standing directly beside you while being completely, genuinely somewhere else. He did not take it personally. He was busy. He was cataloging the Kale Ascendancy's representative at the Verith court. The man's name was Vethdoral, and he had a particular behavior during treaty reading sessions that was different from his behavior at social functions. At social events, he was relaxed, broad gestures, warm tone, the easy comfort of someone performing friendliness he had practiced until it felt natural. During treaty readings, he went very still. He sat forward slightly. His attention sharpened in a specific way, the way attention sharpens when you are listening not for the content of what is being said but for a particular word you are waiting to hear. Ethan wrote it down. He also noted that the 3 senior Verith military advisors never addressed Vethdoral directly. They answered his questions. They responded to his comments. But they never initiated contact with him, never held his eye for more than a second, and consistently spoke slightly past him rather than at him. That pattern had one name in Ethan's experience of human workplaces and platform crews and anywhere else that rank and fear occupied the same room: it was the behavior of people who knew that someone else held leverage they weren't currently showing. He wrote that down too, and sent it in his next transmission to Claire Voss. He sent her transmissions every 2 weeks. They were not urgent. They were not alarming. They read the way his platform reports had read: careful, detailed, written without drama, noting what he saw and what he thought it might mean and what he was not yet sure about. Claire forwarded them without comment. To whom, she did not say. He did not ask. The break in the routine came in the 6th month. He was walking through the residential wing late in the afternoon when he heard it, a sound inside the walls that was slightly wrong. Not dramatically wrong. The kind of wrong that required knowing what the sound was supposed to be in order to hear that it wasn't. A variation in the pressure vibration of the secondary water system, intermittent, with a pattern he recognized from 3 separate incidents during the Pacific survey. Twice that pattern had meant a minor fault. Once it had meant something that required emergency shutdown and a full evacuation drill. He stopped walking. He put his palm flat against the wall. He found the maintenance panel nearby and opened it. Inside the door, stamped in the maintenance log, was a record showing that 3 palace engineers had looked at this same fault 4 months ago and declared it unfixable given available tools and materials. The last entry was 4 months old. No one had come back. Ethan sat down on the floor of the corridor and started working. It took 4 hours. The fault was not complicated on its own, it was 3 separate small problems layered on top of each other in a way that made them look, together, like one large incomprehensible problem. The engineers had seen the combined pattern and stopped. If you knew to separate the layers, to treat each fault individually before looking at the whole, the solution moved forward step by step with no single point that required anything more than patience and steady attention. He talked to himself while he worked. He always did, when he was alone and thinking hard, a habit from 14 months with no other conversation available. He cycled through possibilities out loud, crossed off the ones that didn't hold, moved to the next. He was not performing anything. He was just working. He did not know that Empress Sail Vareth had come down the residential corridor during his second hour. He did not know she had stopped. He did not know she had stood with her back against the opposite wall for 20 minutes, watching him sit cross-legged on the floor in his formal court clothes with both hands inside a maintenance panel, talking quietly to himself in a language she did not understand, not frustrated, not in a hurry, working through each layer of the problem with the particular focus of someone who fully expects to reach the end of it. She did not speak to him before she left. She did not mention it at the next formal appearance, or any appearance after that. But something was different in the way she looked at him when they stood together at the following week's ceremony. Still precise. Still correct. Still, in most measurable ways, absent from the conversation they were technically having. But something in her expression had filed a new piece of information somewhere and had not yet finished deciding what it meant. Ethan sealed the last connection, checked the pressure readings on both sides of the repaired section, confirmed they were stable, and closed the panel. He noted the repair in his notebook. He went back to his room. That evening, Veth Doral's office sent a friendly, routine scheduling request to the Vareth Court's Protocol Division. It asked for a minor adjustment to the following month's treaty review session, moving the main reading date by 4 days, citing a minor calendar conflict. The request was technically within the bounds of the treaty's administrative provisions. It had been worded carefully enough that refusing it would require explaining why the adjustment was a problem, which would require acknowledging that you had noticed it was a problem, which would reveal that you had been paying attention to things people assumed you were not tracking. The new date placed the main treaty reading on a day when 3 of Vareth's senior military advisors would be attending a defense conference off-world. Ethan's transmission to Claire that night was longer than usual. He wrote it carefully, the way he wrote everything, without hurry, without drama, noting what he had seen, what he thought it meant, and what he was not yet certain about. He sent it. He closed his notebook. He looked out the window at the pale sky of Sail Prime, which was turning the deep amber color it always turned at dusk. It was a different sky from any sky he had grown up under. He was getting used to it. He was good at getting used to things. The plan was elegant in the way that only plans built by careful people have time to become. It did not look like an attack. It looked like a systems failure, the kind that happened in old buildings, in atmospheric processors that had been running without major maintenance for long enough that no one expected them to hold perfectly anymore. The kind of failure that produced a medical report afterward, and a period of mourning, and no names attached to any of it. The contaminant was airborne and Vareth-specific. It was designed to move through the environmental systems of the Imperial Complex's residential wing, deploy during the Empress's evening reading hour, and leave behind the kind of cellular damage that would look, in any post-event medical analysis, like an aggressive organ failure consistent with a rare but documented Vareth biological condition. It would be quiet. It would be clean. It would be, in every measurable way, deniable. It was also completely harmless to humans. Ethan was the only person in the residential wing when it deployed, which was not part of anyone's plan. He was there because, 2 hours earlier, he had been walking past the environmental control corridor and had heard a sound in the secondary atmospheric processor that was wrong in the same small, specific way things were wrong just before they failed in a direction that mattered. He had opened the access panel and looked inside and seen a pressure irregularity that he recognized, not from working on atmospheric systems, but from working on any pressurized system long enough to know what certain patterns meant before the instruments registered them as problems. He had gone, without thinking too much about it, to find Vareth's schedule coordinator. He had suggested, in the careful and indirect way he had learned to make suggestions at the Vareth court, never directly, never urgently, always framed as a minor observation that the other person could choose to act on, that perhaps the Empress's evening council meeting might be more comfortable in the East Annex. He mentioned that the air quality in the residential wing had felt slightly off to him that afternoon. He used the word slightly. He used the word perhaps. He kept his face unconcerned. The coordinator had nodded and made the change. Vareth held her evening meeting in the East Annex. The meeting ran long. By the time it ended, the residential wing's atmospheric system had cycled through its deployment phase, completed it, and begun its return to normal readings. The processors showed a minor fluctuation in the logs. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that triggered any automated alerts. Ethan was in his room when the system returned to normal. He made a note in his notebook. He did not include the note in his next transmission to Claire. He filed a routine maintenance observation with the palace's engineering office, citing the pressure irregularity he had noticed, and recommended that the secondary processor in the residential wing be inspected at the earliest convenience. The inspection, when it happened 3 days later, discovered the contaminant delivery mechanism that had been installed inside the processor 6 weeks prior. The investigation that followed was fast and contained and conducted at the highest levels of Verith security. Ethan was not included in it. He was not consulted. He sat at his scheduled functions and said nothing and let the court move around him in the loud, careful way of an institution that has just discovered something serious and is deciding how to handle the information before it handles the problem. The Kale Ascendancy's diplomatic delegation expressed formal outrage when the discovery became known at the Treaty Council level. Their statement described the attempted assassination as obviously the work of internal Verith political rivals, a faction within the Dominion's own power structure, attempting to destabilize the Empire and blame it on an outside party. They expressed deep sympathy. They offered assistance in the investigation. The statement was written with the smooth, practiced calm of people who had prepared it before they needed it. Veth Doral delivered the statement personally. His voice was warm. His posture was appropriately concerned. He did not look at Ethan during the reading. Claire Voss arrived on Sail Prime 6 days later. She came as part of a routine diplomatic delegation, which was the kind of fiction that worked because everyone in the room understood it was a fiction but agreed to treat it as true for the sake of what needed to happen next. She attended 2 formal sessions. She shook hands with appropriate people. She said appropriate things. On the 3rd day, she and Ethan met alone in a room in the human delegation's private wing, a room that Ethan had confirmed, over the previous month, had no active listening architecture. He had done this by watching which rooms the court's own officials used for conversations they did not want recorded, and then using those same rooms for his most ordinary activities until the pattern was established. They sat across from each other. Claire had a data tablet with her. She did not open it. She asked him how he had known about the atmospheric processor. He said he had noticed the pressure reading. She asked him how he had known the pressure reading mattered. He said it had a pattern he recognized. She looked at him for a moment without saying anything. Then she said that his transmissions over the past 8 months had been read by 12 people at various levels of Earth's governmental and military structure, and that those 12 people had been very interested in the scheduling observations, and the Kale representatives' behavioral patterns, and the border patrol rotation gap, and everything else he had included in those quiet, unhurried, twice-monthly notes. Ethan said he was glad the notes had been useful. Claire said that useful was not the word those 12 people had used. She opened the tablet then, and they talked for 37 more minutes in a room with no listening architecture on the diplomatic floor of the Verith Imperial Complex. At the end of the 37 minutes, Ethan had nothing new to add to what he had already sent. He had said everything in the transmissions. He had been saying it for 8 months. He had simply been saying it at a pace that matched the pace of what he was watching. Claire left Sail Prime the following day. 12 hours after her ship cleared the Verith system's outer boundary, a compressed data message left the human diplomatic channel and traveled, encrypted, to Commander Aaron Briggs at Earth's Joint Fleet Station in the Galactic Neutral Zone. The message contained no text. It had no attached briefing or explanation or set of orders written in the usual formal language of military communication. It contained only a set of spatial coordinates and a timestamp. Briggs read it once. He read it a second time to confirm he had understood it the first time. Then he called his senior staff together and gave them a single instruction, not an explanation, not a briefing, just the instruction, and the joint fleet began to move. Back on Sail Prime, Ethan attended his next scheduled function and sat at the end of the table and listened and kept his face attentive and unconcerned. Veth Doral's delegation sat across the chamber. The treaty review session had been moved, per the approved scheduling request, to the new date. 3 of Verith's senior military advisors would be off-world. The formal agenda listed it as a standard periodic review. Ethan Cole had read the treaty's full language 31 times since arriving at the Verith court. He had made notes on every clause. He had cross-referenced the administrative provisions with the security provisions with the territorial provisions with the historical precedents that shaped their interpretation. He had been especially attentive to the clause that had been inserted in the final hours of the original ceasefire negotiations, the one that everyone had agreed to without finishing the sentence. He knew exactly what it meant. He had known for 6 months. He finished his evening meal. He thanked the attendant who cleared his plate, in Verith, which he had never done before. The attendant paused. Looked at him. Did not know what to do with that. Ethan smiled and went back to his room. He had one more transmission to send to Claire before the treaty review session. It was brief. It said that he thought the timeline was correct. It said he would be ready. He sent it. He closed his notebook. He went to sleep. The emergency session of the Galactic Treaty Council was called in the name of stability, which was the word the Kale Ascendancy's formal request used 11 times across 14 paragraphs. The request argued that the current treaty structure had been compromised by Verith internal disorder, by the failed mechanisms of a peace built on a foundation that had never been solid, and by the fundamental problem of a guarantor species that lacked the standing, the experience, and the basic galactic maturity to fulfill a role of this complexity. The session was held in the great chamber of the neutral station above the Verith system's outer edge. The chamber was built for exactly this kind of moment, high and circular, with tiered seating that placed every representative at the same elevation as every other, which was the architectural expression of an idea that the galaxy had not always practiced as consistently as it claimed. 47 species had sent their delegations. Every major news network in the explored galaxy was transmitting live. Archon Drevos Kale himself came. That alone said what the session was actually for. He was not the kind of figure who attended routine reviews. He was the kind of figure who appeared at endings and beginnings, at the moments that would be in the histories. He stood at the floor of the chamber with the ease of someone who had decided on the outcome before he entered the room, which he had, and made his speech. It was a very good speech. He had clearly spent time on it. He spoke about the 60 years of suffering that both the Verith Dominion and the Kale Ascendancy had endured. He spoke about the genuine desire for peace that his people carried and had always carried, even through the worst of the conflict. He spoke about the importance of building that peace on real foundations rather than on gestures that satisfied the requirements of tradition without satisfying the requirements of reality. He said that the Kale Ascendancy was formally withdrawing from the ceasefire agreement. He said that the treaty, as it currently existed, was a document without a legitimate guarantor, that Earth lacked the standing to fulfill that role, that the spousal arrangement had always been a diplomatic courtesy extended to a species too young to understand what it was being asked to do, and that no one in the chamber could honestly pretend otherwise. He did not use the word joke. He did not need to. The framing of his speech did the same work without the word. He finished. He stood back. The chamber settled into the particular quiet of a room waiting for the expected response, the counter-argument, the appeal, the carefully prepared diplomatic statement from the Verith side, or perhaps from Earth's attaché, or from someone with the rank and standing and correct papers to push back against a speech that had just, in formal language, announced the end of 60 years of fragile quiet. Ethan Cole stood up from the seat at the far end of the delegate table. It was the symbolic seat. The decorative one. The one at the end because the table had to end somewhere and the human husband had to sit somewhere, and that seemed like the appropriate place for both of those facts to intersect. He did not raise his hand first. There was no formal request to address the chamber. He simply stood up, and the room, which had been waiting for someone more important to speak, was quiet enough that the movement registered before anyone had decided whether to object to it. He began to speak. He spoke in the galactic common tongue, which he had used for every public appearance since his arrival. His voice was the same as it always was, level, unhurried, without performance. He did not use the formal speech register that council members used in the chamber. He spoke the way he spoke when he was working through a problem out loud, plainly, with each piece placed in its correct order before the next one was introduced. He said that Archon Kale's speech had been accurate in its description of what the treaty currently looked like. He agreed with that description. He was not here to argue with the surface of it. He said he wanted to talk about what the treaty actually was, underneath the surface, and what Earth had been doing while the galaxy read the surface and stopped there. He called up the first display. It was a map. Not a political map, those were everywhere, and everyone in the room had seen them. It was an infrastructure map, showing communications relay nodes and logistics architecture and autonomous monitoring systems. The coverage was extensive. It stretched across 17 systems. Several of those systems were ones that the great powers had left unclaimed because they appeared to contain nothing worth claiming, which was a conclusion that several species had arrived at when they looked only at the obvious resources and did not look at the geography. Ethan said that Earth had been seeding this network for 40 years. He moved to the next display. It showed 14 names. 14 species, all of them small, all of them currently categorized by the galactic community as minor powers, the kind that attended treaty sessions as observers, that were consulted for courtesy and not for substance, that had learned over centuries of galactic politics that their size meant their voice was decorative. Each of the 14 had a date beside its name. Each date was the day that species had entered a formal mutual defense agreement with Earth, witnessed, signed, and on record in the appropriate archives. Most of the agreements were between 7 and 30 years old. The oldest one predated the current ceasefire negotiations. Earth had been having conversations with those 14 species for decades, in the quiet margins of every major summit, in the side rooms and the follow-up communications and the long patient correspondence that no one paid attention to because the parties involved were not considered important enough to monitor carefully. Ethan moved to the third display. It showed the clause. The one from the original ceasefire treaty. The one inserted in the final hours of negotiation, agreed to in the tired late stages of a session that had run 3 days without a real break, when everyone wanted to finish and go home. It was 12 lines of formal treaty language and it defined, in specific terms, what actions against the designated guarantor species would constitute under the treaty security provisions. He read 2 sentences of it aloud. Not quickly. He let them sit. Then he explained what the Kale military repositioning of the past 4 months constituted, under those 2 sentences. He showed the documentation. Dates, coordinates, movement records, all cross-referenced against the clause's specific language. He had been building this document for 6 months. It was very complete. Archon Kale's expression did not change. But he had gone still in the way that Ethan had watched Veth Doral go still during treaty readings, the particular stillness of someone listening for a specific word and having heard it. Ethan said that under the treaty's provisions, and with the documentation now on record in this session, Earth's response to the repositioning was legally sanctioned. He said that Commander Aaron Briggs' Joint Fleet was already at the relevant coordinates. He did not say it was the most powerful fleet in the galaxy. It was not. It did not need to be. It was in the correct place at the correct time with the correct documentation, and it had 47 allied species who had just spent the past 20 minutes watching the species everyone had categorized as decorative layout, piece by piece and without raising its voice, 40 years of paying careful attention to all of them. He sat down. The chamber was quiet. Not the polite quiet of a room waiting for the next speaker. The other kind of quiet. The kind that comes when a room full of people does the same arithmetic at the same time and gets the same answer. Archon Kale did not finish his speech. He did not make a second speech. He sat down slowly, with the look of a man recalculating something large and finding that the numbers were different from what he had prepared for. 47 delegations were very still. At the end of the table, in the decorative seat, Ethan Cole folded his hands and waited. He looked the same as he had looked at every function, every dinner, every formal appearance for the past 14 months, present, patient, unhurried. A piece of equipment that had been correctly set and was running exactly as it was supposed to run. Outside the station, Commander Briggs' fleet held position at the coordinates and waited. The silence stretched. Nobody filled it. Nobody wanted to be the first one to speak into it and find out what the new shape of the room was. The Kale ascendancy did not go to war. It took 3 days after the council session for Archon Kale's office to issue a formal statement, which was 3 days of the kind of internal recalculation that does not happen quickly because it cannot. You cannot rush the process of adjusting a political position that was built on 40 years of a specific assumption, when the assumption has just been shown, in a chamber full of witnesses and live transmissions, to have been wrong. It takes time to find the new footing. It takes more time to find the language that makes the new footing look like intention rather than retreat. The statement, when it came, said that the Kale ascendancy remained committed to a lasting peace. It said that the repositioning had been a defensive measure, mischaracterized by parties with an interest in creating instability. It said that Kale looked forward to a renewed and strengthened treaty framework built on honest foundations. It did not say anything about the clause. It did not say anything about the fleet. It did not mention Ethan Cole. The treaty held. It held differently than it had before, not as a paper structure propped up by the assumption that the human guarantor was decorative and therefore manageable, but as something with actual weight in it now, actual consequence, the kind of peace that held not because everyone liked it but because the math of not holding it had become clearly unfavorable. That was a harder kind of peace to build and a more durable one to have, once built. The political restructuring that followed took 18 months. Claire Voss did not sleep through most of it. She worked the new framework clause by clause, session by session, in the careful and relentless way of someone who has been doing difficult work for a long time and knows that the work does not finish when the dramatic moment does, it finishes much later, in rooms much less interesting than a council chamber, with much less silence to mark the progress. She sent Ethan regular updates because he asked for them and because he had earned them. He read them carefully and occasionally sent back questions that turned out to be useful. He was not credited in any of the framework documents. He did not ask to be. He was still living at the Verith Imperial Complex. The dynamic at court had shifted in ways that were not announced and not discussed but were visible to anyone paying attention, and Ethan was always paying attention. Guards who had looked past him began to meet his eye briefly when he passed. Court officials who had routed communications around him began, occasionally, to route them through him. Nothing large. Nothing formal. The shift was in small things, in the room a conversation was held in who was asked before a decision was finalized, in the slight but consistent change in where he was placed at the tables. He was still at the end of the table. But the far end had become less far. Verith herself was harder to read. She was always harder to read than anything else in the complex, which was part of what made her good at what she did and part of what had kept her empire intact while others around it dissolved. She performed no visible change in how she engaged with Ethan at formal functions. She was still precise. She was still correct. She was still, in the external sense, elsewhere. But she came to find him one evening, 3 weeks after the restructuring sessions concluded. He was on the observation deck of the complex's upper tower, a wide, open platform with low railings and a clear view of the sky in every direction. He went there in the evening sometimes, when the day's work was done and the amber dusk of Sail Prime was fading into the deep navy of its night. He stood at the railing and watched the sky the way he had watched the ocean floor from the platform, not expecting anything from it, just present in it, cataloging without agenda. She came up behind him quietly. She stood beside him at the railing and looked at the same sky. Neither of them spoke for a while. This was, by now, not an unusual thing between them. They had spent many formal hours in the same room without talking, and silence between two people who are both comfortable with it is different from the silence between two people who are not. She said, eventually, that she owed him an apology. She said that she had treated him, from the beginning, as a symbol, which was what he had been presented to her as, and which she had accepted because it was the convenient thing to accept, and convenience was not a defense she was proud of. Ethan looked out at the dark sky for a moment before answering. He said she didn't owe him an apology for that. He said she had seen an asset in him while her counsel saw a prop, and that was a different kind of vision even if it wasn't yet the full picture. He said he had not arrived at her court expecting anything else, and he had not been wrong to not expect it. She was quiet for a moment. Then she asked him what the full picture had been, from his side of it. He thought about how to answer that in a way that was honest without being larger than it needed to be. He looked out at the stars, the same stars that looked different from here than from Earth, had always looked different, and that he had gotten used to slowly and without drama. He said that humanity had spent a very long time being told it was too small to matter. He said that most species, when they heard that message long enough, in enough rooms and from enough directions, eventually started to believe it. They adjusted their expectations down. They stopped building for things outside that smaller size. He said that humans had done something different with the message. They had started taking notes. They had paid attention to every room they were not supposed to be important in. They had listened in every conversation they were not supposed to be able to follow. They had built things in the systems no one was watching because no one thought they were worth watching, and they had been patient about it in the way that things are patient when they know they have time and have decided to use it correctly. Verith said nothing for a long while. She was looking at the same stars. Her face was the same as it always was, still, unperformative, thinking something she was not sharing yet. Eventually she said that she understood that. Ethan did not know exactly what she meant by it, whether she meant the strategy or the patience or the long history underneath both of them, and he did not ask. Some things were better left with enough space around them to mean more than one thing at once. They stood at the railing until the sky had gone fully dark and the stars of the sail system were out in their full number, which was a lot of stars, more than you could count, more than anyone had names for. Back on Earth, in Portland, Mara Ellison received a short transmission from her brother. It had come through the diplomatic channel because that was the only channel that reached all the way to Sail Prime with any regularity, and so his messages always arrived with a small official header that was jarring every time and never got less jarring. The message said he was well. It said the food was still something he was working on figuring out. It said the stars looked different from here but that he had gotten used to it, mostly. She read it 3 times. She sat with it for a while before she wrote back. She thought about the brother she had known growing up, quiet, attentive, always fixing things that other people had decided were too broken to be worth fixing, and she thought about all the rooms he had been sitting at the end of for the past 14 months, listening, noting, sending his patient twice-monthly transmissions to people who had not, at first, understood what they were reading. She thought about what the transmissions had turned out to be. She wrote back something short. She said she was glad he was well. She said the stars looked fine from here too, for what it was worth. Across the explored galaxy, 47 species were doing the same arithmetic they had been doing since the day of the council session, quietly, in their own chambers, in their own languages, without sharing the calculation aloud. The arithmetic was simple. It did not require special knowledge or specialized training. It only required looking at what had happened and following the line of it back through 40 years to the beginning. Humanity had been in every room. Humanity had been at every table. Humanity had been placed at the ends of those tables and served food it was not sure about and given schedules of functions no one expected it to take seriously, and it had taken all of it seriously, every single piece, in the quiet and unhurried way of a species that had decided not to be what it was told it was. The galaxy was very quiet now. It was not a comfortable quiet. It was the quiet of many things being reconsidered at the same time, in private, by people who were not ready to say out loud what the reconsideration was producing. It was the quiet that comes not at the beginning of something but in the moment between the ending of the old thing and the naming of the new one. Nobody had thought to watch what the human husband was learning. That had been the first mistake. It would not be made again.